What would you do if you were told you could win a war, a total global conflict, without an invasion? If you could dismantle an enemy's society from 20,000 feet in the air, using a weapon so precise it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel? What if you were told this new kind of warfare would be more moral, more surgical, saving millions of lives by targeting only the enemy's industrial heart, leaving civilians untouched? You'd call it a revolution. You'd pour all your resources into it. You'd bet the entire future of the free world on it. This was the promise of a small group of radical thinkers in the 1930s, a group that came to be known as the Bomber Mafia. They were zealots, prophets of a new age of aerial warfare. Most generals, men who had seen the mud and blood of the trenches in World War I, called it a fantasy. Billy Mitchell, their spiritual father, was court-martialed for believing in it so fiercely. Meanwhile, Hitler's industrial machine was a roaring fire, consuming Europe piece by piece. Every day the world waited. That fire grew stronger, its factories churning out tanks and planes at a rate that seemed unstoppable. The Bomber Mafia promised a way to put out that fire, not with the blood of a million soldiers, but with the cold, clean logic of an engineer. But they didn't know their beautiful, precise theory contained a single, fatal flaw. A flaw that would lead not to a clean, surgical victory, but to the most horrific acts of destruction in human history. And, 80 years later, that same flawed logic, twisted and misunderstood, would be used to build the digital world you and I live in right now. And what happens next will blow your mind. But quick, if you want more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the untold side of WWII, smash that subscribe button. Trust me, next video's story is even more unbelievable. This is a story about two Silicon Valleys, the one you know in California and the first one, which was the sky over Nazi Germany. It's a story told in 5 parallel threads, all weaving together. The first thread is the Bomber Mafia's obsession, that you could win a war by bombing a handful of key industrial targets, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, power grids, and the enemy's economy would simply collapse. They called it the industrial web theory. The second thread is the technology they built to do it. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a marvel of engineering, and its secret weapon, the Norden bombsight, a mechanical computer so advanced it was rumored to be the key to winning the war. The third thread is the human cost. The thousands of young men, barely out of their teens, who were asked to fly these unproven machines into the most heavily defended airspace in history. Their average lifespan over Germany was measured in weeks. The fourth thread is the enemy, a resilient, adaptive German war machine that refused to follow the script, that repaired factories faster than they could be destroyed, and whose fighter pilots learned to hunt the bombers with ruthless efficiency. And the fifth, most important thread is the one that connects their world to ours. It's the story of a philosophical pivot, a moment when the dream of precision failed, and a new, much darker idea took its place. An idea that would be inherited, half-remembered, by a new generation of founders and engineers who would adopt its methods without ever understanding its horrific origins. They were, in a way, the original startup founders, pitching a world-changing idea, funded by the largest venture capitalist on Earth, the United States government. Their product was victory, and they promised to deliver it with minimal bloodshed. The infamous slapping incidents had nearly ended George Patton's career. But this was a different kind of risk. Not the risk of one man's reputation, but of an entire strategic doctrine. The primary mystery was simple. Could this theory actually work? Could you really bomb your way to victory? But underneath that were dozens of other questions. Would the Norden bombsight live up to its promise? Could the B-17 survive without fighter escorts? Would the Germans adapt? And the biggest question of all, one nobody dared to ask, what would they do if the theory was wrong? The oscillation between hope and despair began almost immediately. The first taste of success was the technology itself. The B-17 was a masterpiece, a self-defending bomber bristling with 13 50 caliber machine guns, earning it the name the Flying Fortress. And inside it, the Norden bomb sight. It was a beautiful, complex instrument of brass and steel, a mechanical analog computer that, in theory, could account for altitude, airspeed, wind drift, even the rotation of the Earth. Pilots and bombardiers were told it could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. It was a technological solution to a human problem. It was the promise of a clean war. It was hope, manufactured from aluminum and glass. But then came the failure, the crushing reality of combat over Europe. In the freezing, violent, chaotic skies over Germany, the theory met its brutal counterpoint. The pickle barrel was a myth. The jet stream, a river of high-altitude air nobody knew existed, threw the bombs miles off course. Clouds obscured the targets for weeks on end, and the German Luftwaffe was not a static target. It was a thinking, learning, killing machine. They learned to attack the bombers from the front, where their defenses were weakest. The sky was filled with flak, clouds of black smoke and shrapnel that tore through the unpressurized aluminum fuselages. The hope began to drain away, replaced with a cold, creeping anxiety. Still, they pressed on. A mini-success. The plan for the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. It was audacious. A two-pronged attack deep into Germany, targeting the heart of the Nazi ball-bearing and aircraft industries. If this worked, it could cripple German production, shorten the war by months, even years. It was the theory's ultimate test. The men were briefed, the planes were fueled. There was a sense of grim determination, of history being made, and then utter, catastrophic failure. August 17th and then October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. 60 bombers, 600 men, lost in a single day during the second Schweinfurt raid. 60 more heavily damaged. The Luftwaffe tore them to pieces. The survivors who limped back to England told stories of watching their friends' planes explode in fireballs, of men bailing out into enemy territory, of a sky so thick with fighters you couldn't count them. The information revealed was devastating. Without long-range fighter escorts that could go all the way to the target and back, the Flying Fortress was a myth. It was a flying coffin. The bomber mafia's core assumption that the bombers could defend themselves was wrong. This changed everything. It reframed the prophets from geniuses into reckless, hubristic dreamers. It opened a new, terrifying question. If the bombers can't get to the targets, how can the theory ever work? This forced a decision upon the generals, a man named Curtis LeMay chief among them. He was a hard, pragmatic, cigar-chomping realist. He saw the theory wasn't working. He had two choices: abandon the entire project of daylight precision bombing, admitting defeat, or change the equation. The pressure chamber began to build. Every 2 minutes, the stakes escalated. By 1944, the stakes weren't just about a theory anymore. They were about the upcoming D-Day invasion. For the landings to succeed, the Allies needed total air superiority over the beaches of Normandy. That meant the Luftwaffe had to be destroyed. The job fell to the bombers. The pressure from Eisenhower and the Supreme High Command was immense. The entire invasion, the fate of the Western Front, now rested on their shoulders. But the mystery of how to solve the escort problem remained. The answer was being developed in secret. A new plane, the P-51 Mustang. It was a beautiful, revolutionary fighter. But would it work? Could it truly fly all the way to Berlin and back? The answer was delayed, feeding the desperation. The oscillations became faster, more violent. They developed new tactics, like the combat box formation, a staggered defensive arrangement of bombers for mutual fire support, a success. But the Germans developed new cannons that could tear a B-17's wing off from 1,000 yards away. A failure. The P-51s finally arrived in theater, with new drop tanks giving them the range they needed. A huge success. But then the Germans deployed the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, which could slice through the bomber formations at speeds the Mustangs couldn't match. A terrifying failure. A single problem, the resilience of the Luftwaffe, was cascading through all the threads. The bomber losses meant lower morale, which meant pressure from Washington to stop the raids, which, if they did, would mean the Luftwaffe would be at full strength for D-Day, which could mean the entire invasion would fail. Every 60 seconds, a micro-mystery was resolved just to keep the crews going. What was the exact range of the P-51 with drop tanks? Answered. How many ball bearings did Schweinfurt actually produce? Answered. These small dopamine hits of information were just enough to maintain engagement while the big, terrifying question loomed. Will we break them before they break us? The personal connection to this struggle became visceral. For the engineers at home, it was the universal challenge of pivoting mid-project when your core assumptions are proven wrong. For the men in the air, it was the aspirational trait of pure courage in the face of impossible odds. The reports detailed the conditions: temperatures of 60 below zero, frostbite forming on exposed skin in seconds, the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of 8-hour missions in constant mortal terror. And then, in the spring of 1944, the convergence, the breaking point where all systems fired simultaneously. All plot lines reached their crisis at the exact same moment. The bomber mafia's original theory of precision bombing against the industrial web was now, in its purest form, considered a failure. It hadn't caused the German economy to collapse. The technology, the B-17s, were still effective, but had been proven fatally vulnerable without support. The human cost had reached its absolute peak, with the 8th Air Force suffering more combat deaths than the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the war. The enemy was on the ropes, but still lethally dangerous, their new jets a terrifying unknown. And the pressure was at its maximum. D-Day was weeks away. The Luftwaffe had to be broken now. There were no more delays. This led to a final, forced decision, a pivot born of desperation. The target was no longer the German economy. The target was the Luftwaffe itself. The new plan was simple and brutal. Send the bombers deep into Germany, not just to bomb factories, but to act as bait. To force the German fighters into the air where the swarms of P-51s could hunt them down and destroy them. It was a complete reversal of the original doctrine. The bombers were now expendable assets in a war of attrition. For 2 solid minutes of strategic time, there was no relief, only sustained negative tension. The bombers went out, the fighters rose to meet them, and the skies became a charnel house. The losses continued to be horrific. Would the plan work? Would they run out of pilots before the Germans did? It was a numbers game, a grim calculus of death. And for a moment, it seemed like it could go either way. The viewer is at a breaking point, a neurochemical storm of maximum cortisol and norepinephrine, desperate for relief, for an answer. Then, the cascade, all the systems resolving in a coordinated, lightning-fast sequence. The first domino fell. The new strategy worked. The P-51s, now freed to hunt, were devastatingly effective. They called it the Big Week in February 1944. The Luftwaffe rose to the bait, and they were slaughtered. The most experienced German pilots were killed. Their replacement pilots were undertrained, rushed into combat. The environmental pressure of an unbeatable enemy was finally, decisively removed. The viewer's cortisol begins to drop. A hit of dopamine. Finally. This triggered the second domino, air superiority. With the Luftwaffe shattered, the bombers could now roam over Germany with dramatically lower losses. The impact was immediate. They could now systematically attack the targets they had failed to destroy a year earlier. But this time, They also targeted Germany's synthetic oil production. The strategic threat began to collapse. The viewer gets a second, bigger dopamine hit. The third domino, the German collapse on the ground. Without fuel for its tanks and planes due to the bombing of oil facilities, the German army was crippled. When the D-Day invasion finally happened, the Allied forces faced an enemy that could not effectively move its armored divisions, an enemy with almost no air support. The success of the air war directly enabled the success of the ground war. The strategic pressure is eliminated. The viewer feels a sense of justice, of schadenfreude. The fourth domino. The siege was lifted, not on a city, but on the minds of the air crews. The terror of the early raids was replaced with a sense of grim professionalism. They had survived. They had won. The humanitarian crisis of unsustainable losses was averted. The viewer feels a wave of oxytocin, of relief for the men they've been following. The fifth domino. The redemption of the theory, but in a twisted form. Was the bomber mafia's original idea crazy or genius? The answer was both. The precision part was a failure, but the core idea that air power could be a decisive, war-winning weapon was validated. LeMay and the others had been vindicated, not for their original elegant theory, but for their brutal, adaptive, ruthless pivot. The viewer feels a sense of vicarious vindication. He wasn't crazy. He was just willing to do what was necessary. And the final sixth domino, historical significance. The strategic bombing campaign, for all its failures and moral compromises, was a key factor in the defeat of Nazi Germany. It crippled their industry, destroyed their air force, and saved countless Allied soldiers' lives during the ground invasion. This is the payoff, the sense of meaning and completion. A cascade of catharsis. 6 major payoffs in 3 minutes. But the story doesn't end there. The most important domino was yet to fall, and it fell on the other side of the world. Curtis LeMay, the man who had perfected the brutal math of the air war in Europe, was transferred to the Pacific. His target was now Japan. His weapon was the new B-29 Superfortress. But the old problems returned. The jet stream over Japan was even stronger. Precision bombing from high altitude was impossible. The pressure from Washington was absolute. End the war. Now. So LeMay made another pivot. He looked at the data. He saw that Japanese industry wasn't concentrated in massive factories. It was dispersed into small workshops in cities made of wood and paper. A precision strategy would never work, so he abandoned it entirely. He took the guns and armor out of his B-29s, allowing them to fly lower and carry more bombs. And he replaced the high explosives with a new weapon, napalm incendiaries. On the night of March 9, 1945, he sent 300 B-29s low over Tokyo. The result was a firestorm, a hurricane of flame that was so hot it boiled the water in the canals. More people died in that one raid than in the initial blasts at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the most destructive air raid in human history. And it worked. City after city was burned off the map. Japan's ability to wage war was incinerated. The lesson the system learned, the lesson LeMay embodied, was not about the moral failure of the original theory, but the stunning, undeniable success of the brutal pivot. The lesson was this: when your elegant, precise solution fails to achieve its objective, you don't refine it. You abandon it. You find a blunter instrument and apply it at a scale your enemy cannot possibly withstand. Move fast. Break things. The collateral damage is not a bug. It is a feature of overwhelming force. That generation of men, the systems analysts from the Rand Corporation, the engineers who had built the weapons, the logisticians who had run the war, they went on to build the modern corporate and technological world. They brought that mindset with them. It was an inheritance. And so, decades later, when a young Mark Zuckerberg declared his company's motto would be "Move fast and break things," he wasn't inventing a new philosophy. He was channeling the ghost of Curtis LeMay. He was using the playbook. When Facebook rolled out the newsfeed, fundamentally breaking the concept of online privacy without asking anyone's permission, it was the Tokyo playbook. When Uber launched in city after city, ignoring local regulations and breaking the taxi industry, it was the Tokyo playbook. When AI companies scraped the entire internet, breaking copyright and ingesting the creative work of millions to achieve scale, it is the Tokyo playbook. The goal is not precision. The goal is not elegance. The goal is to overwhelm the existing system with such speed and scale that it collapses before it can react. The broken things are no longer factories or enemy cities. The broken things are social trust. The broken things are local economies. The broken things are the privacy we thought we had. The broken things are our shared sense of reality. We live in the world the bomber mafia's failure created. We celebrate the innovators who move fast, but we rarely stop to examine the things they break along the way, or the fires they start that can no longer be put out. LeMay's firebombing was justified at the time as a terrible necessity, a brutal calculation to end the war and save 1 million American soldiers who might have died in a ground invasion of Japan. But as LeMay was perfecting his firestorms, another group of scientists working in total secret in the deserts of New Mexico believed they had found the truly precise weapon the bomber mafia had always dreamed of. A weapon so powerful, so absolute, it could end the war not with 1,000 planes, but with just one. They were led by a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist who was both brilliant and haunted. Their belief in a clean technological solution to the messiness of human conflict would echo the bomber mafia's original dream and its terrible, unforeseen consequences. They thought they were building a weapon to end all wars. What they actually built was the permanent looming possibility of apocalypse. The story of the Manhattan Project isn't just about building a bomb. It's about what happens when the smartest people in the world work in isolation to solve a purely technical problem, without fully grappling with the human system they are about to unleash it upon. It's the ultimate story of unintended consequences, the second pillar of the modern world we've inherited. And that story is next.